Hello students, this is the second video lecture of week 8 and in this lecture my plan is to share with you an account of the city and temple building practices of the third dynasty of Ur kings and how they gave shape to especially the two important Mesopotamian cities at this time, particularly Ur, which was which was a port city very close to the Persian Gulf, and served as the capital city of the third dynasty of Ur, and especially with the spectacular temple complex dedicated to the moon god Inanna. And then the second city we're going to discuss is Nippur, which was a pan-Mesopotamian holy city and pilgrimage center with a very special status of inviolability and kind of really being above politics. This material will help us to think about Ur-3 kings as avid builders, really very dedicated builders, temple builders, really enthusiastic on their devotion to various Mesopotamian deities, which they appeased with their excessive architectural projects. So let's look at this. When you look at sites like that, or Nippur today, you won't be able to see anything that is spectacular remaining from that kind of really incredible, sort of very lively, spectacular cities of the ancient world, simply because the river has moved away and settlement has moved away, and this became a kind of really a desert landscape. So that's why when archaeologists work in such sites, they really need a lot of imagination to kind of really think about these cities in their heyday, in their liveliness and festivals and so on. If you look at the map of southern Mesopotamia we're looking at today, building activities in these two important cities, Nippur and then Ur in the southern part of Mesopotamia. Both cities were already important and prosperous cities during the early dynastic periods, which we studied a few weeks ago, in the earlier part of the 3rd millennium BCE. And you'll recall that at least the royal tombs of Ur from Ur that were excavated at Ur. However, the most significant architectural evidence in the city of Ur comes from the time of the Ur-3 kings, as the kings of this dynasty made really massive investments in building these two important cities. The city of Nippur had a very special status, as I mentioned in the beginning of the lecture, among all the Mesopotamian cities at this time, as Nippur was serving as a pan-Mesopotamian holy city and place of pilgrimage. It was known as the Dur Anki, the bond of heaven and earth, or earthly places, the city that connected the world of the humans to the world of gods, to the heavens. And politically speaking, actually, while every city literally was controlled by one king or one dynasty, Nippur was not controlled by any of them, and so different kings and dynasties competed to sponsor building projects in Nippur because of its kind of really unique status. If you look at some of the epic poems that are actually composed about Nippur itself, for example, the hymn of Enlil, the city, the status of Nippur and its holiness becomes really clearly articulated. So in the hymn to Enlil, in lines 65 to 73, we read, "Enlil, when you mapped out the holy settlement on earth, you built the city Nippur by yourself, the Kiur, your pure place, in the Dur-Anki, in the middle of the four quarters of the earth, you founded it. Its soil is life of the land, the life of all the foreign lands. It's really, Nippur is really presented as this kind of really divine foundation in the middle of Sumer. Its brickwork is gleaming gold. Its foundation is lapis lazuli. Like a steer, it raises up its horns in Sumer. All the lands bow their heads. At its great feasts, the people spend the day in abundance. So the way that it is portrayed is really quite poetic, but also this notion of prosperity and this notion of divine status is very, very clear. From here on, actually, we can say that easily deduct that Nippur was a pan-Mesopotamian ceremonial and cult center, and its patron deity was Enlil, in such a way that Enlil's own name was used actually as part of the writing of the name of Nippur itself. Basically, Nippur equaled to Dingur Enlil Ki, the place of the god of Enlil. It's also known as the city of decisions, the place of divine and human assemblies, known as Ukin, and the shrine where destinies were decreed. So this was a kind of also an oracle place as well. Politically speaking, this corresponded, according to a number of Mesopotamian historians, that the city was the center of the Kengir League, this kind of political league of dynasties and kingdoms. It was some kind of a supra-political center that no one actually politically controlled, but it was a place where these different dynasties came together and agreed on things and collaborated with each other. And then by virtue of all of this, Nippur was also a city of scribes and scholars. It had a giant library, and it really acted as a center of learning. On an ancient clay tablet from the late Bronze Age, from the Kassite period, we're very lucky to have this plan of Nippur sort of really incised and drawn and inscribed on the face of this tablet. And this is one of the very rare urban plans that we have from ancient Mesopotamia. This map was found by archaeologists from the University of Pennsylvania team in Nippur. And the drawing of the city layout also is fascinatingly labeled. So various urban components within the map are labeled, as you can see, with these kind of cuneiform signs. And the particular urban features like the city wall, the Euphrates River, the canal that goes through the city, the names of various kinds of gates, canals, gardens, temples, and so on are introduced to us. The names of the gates were given as a kind of a really good sense of both the direction of particular roads, like the gate facing Ur, gate facing Uruk. Those are the kind of really the eastern gates. But also some link to particular deities like the Nergal gate or the Gula gate. On the northeast edge of its layout, we see Ekur, the famous sanctuary of Enlil, that we will look at in sort of from the perspective of archaeology as well. There has been a number of archaeological projects at Nippur, given that it has been a very, very important site, and one of the earliest, starting with really Austin Henry Laird, who got really frustrated when he dug some trenches in 1851. And of course, he's not the kind of really patient archaeological scientist. He was kind of really looting and looking for sculpture to take to the British Museum. So he got really quickly frustrated with Nippur, because Nippur is a kind of place that required meticulous scientific work, and of course Layard did not have any patience for something like that as a treasure hunter. So in the sense, the work carried out by the University of Pennsylvania later at the end of the 19th century, and then mid 20th century onwards by the Oriental Institute, then are a particularly important scientific work, as they excavated many important monumental structures, but they also recovered an extraordinary amount of cuneiform tablets, which are housed in those institutions, the University of Pennsylvania and the Oriental Institute. In fact, the University of Pennsylvania collection is so large in terms of its tablets in Sumerian that University of Pennsylvania is actually running a Sumerian dictionary project, particularly because they really hold a massive amount of these tablets, particularly school archives, that actually in temple archives that came from this particular site. This map, which is a juxtaposition of the ancient Kassite map of the city with the modern topographic survey of archaeological teams, shows the kind of work that was carried out by various archaeological projects. A great majority of the building remains that we actually have excavated from Nippur date to the third dynasty of Ur kings, particularly. Especially including Ekur, the house, the mountain, which was the sanctuary of Enlil, which had a major construction at the time of Ur-Namma, with reparations and more construction at the time of Shulgi and Amar-Sin in the 21st century. And then the sanctuary of Inanna, which was a construction of Shulgi, and we're going to look at that one as well. We have evidence about sort of Ur-Nammu and Ibisin's work at the fortification walls, and so on. We know we have all this information, and particularly the kind of information about which kings were repairing and building what parts of the city quite well, because the Ur-3 kings were very systematic in leaving what we call foundation deposits. Foundation deposits are little deposits that actually record a particular construction or restoration activity, and they're deposited in the form of inscriptions, food offerings, and little statuettes like the one on the top right that actually record a building project. And the little statuettes, like the one on top right, is actually a depiction of the Ur-3 king as a builder, he's carrying the basket of bricks on his head, which actually depicts the king as an avid builder, as a temple builder, as a devout builder of God's temples. And this image of the Ur-3 king as a builder, as an avid builder, became a very prominent notion, the definition, really literally the definition of kingship in among the benevolent ruler among the third dynasty kings. The architecture of the sanctuary of Enlil, if you look at it, was monumentalized and substantially built by the Ur-3 kings, Ur-Namma, Shulgi, and Amar-Sin in late 21st century BCE, as we have studied in lecture 8.1. So the strictly orthogonal plan of the complex, the organization of space with really massive courtyards. The central monumental feature of the sanctuary, the Monumental Ziggurat, which is this kind of black rectangle over there, which was a stepped tower, sort of multi-staged temple tower, are really the sort of really hallmarks of this kind of Ur-3 architect's design. It's rather innovative because we're actually starting to see this kind of orthogonal planning really with the Ur-3 kings. If you compare this, for example, to Temple Oval in Kafage, which was built in the middle of the 3rd millennium BCE, you see this kind of arrangement of courtyards and moving up in several stages towards the small, sort of really high shrine in the Temple Oval. But this kind of orthogonal planning becomes a kind of a really hallmark of Ur-3 kings. But let's look at another really temple excavation, the sanctuary of Inanna, which gives us a really great body of information that is layered and very rich, and it's also a very important example that shows the kind of really integration of Ur-3 kings intervention, the specific architectural intervention by Ur-3 kings. This area is excavated very carefully by archaeologists, and so they had a great trouble because the building really started as an area of humble houses, and then continued into a neighborhood shrine, a very modest neighborhood shrine, which was eventually got monumentalized and finally completely rebuilt by Ur-3 kings. So we're going to look at that, and I'm showing you my drawing on the left of that kind of neighborhood shrine status. And this is what Richard Haynes, the architect at Nippur Excavations in 1956, writes in his notebook. He says, "The plan looks better on paper than in actuality, and is a reconstructor's dream. I've never seen a building where so little will look so much after it's drawn on good black ink." So he's kind of really frustrated with what he's seeing on the ground, but then when you actually sort of start to put it on paper, it starts to make sense. So if we look at the stratigraphy of this, is really quite interesting. Again, in the earliest levels in the stratigraphy, it starts as private houses, which then it gets transformed into a small neighborhood shrine. In level 8, we see a kind of a really slight monumentalization of the temple. And in level 7, which is what I'm illustrating on the left in my drawing, we're showing a temple complex with a kind of complex design layout. There's a little columnar sort of court. There's a freestanding sanctuary in the middle, sort of really, I marked it by hard. There's a lone room type cella where this statue of the god would stand, and so on. So it's a really quite interesting, but kind of still very organic and less orthogonal layout. In this context, and that sort of early temple is actually, this temple is, what we see here is contemporaneous to Temple Oval. So think about the sort of middle of the 3rd millennium, the early dynastic 3 period. In here, the archaeologists excavated in these levels a number of statues like this one. That kind of really works really well with what we know from Tel Asmar, the Abu statues, Abu temple statues, and others. But if you look at the intervention, the next phase is incredible. So in the time of Shulgi, the Ur-3 king Shulgi, there's a major intervention, and this really organic and nicely grown architecture is completely razed, and it's replaced by this massive temple complex that is very strictly strictly orthogonal, really extraordinarily regularized, and kind of really organized around these four main courts, and then even fortified on either side with these kind of really thick walls. And what does this kind of really, this idea of top-down architectural design intervention, what does that imply? That would be a really important thing to discuss. But this kind of change from this building to this is really, in my opinion, rather radical. The last building that I will show from Nippur is this temple to Gula, which was a healing sanctuary dedicated to the healing god Gula. And the healers of the city, the Asu and the magician Asipu, were probably associated with this building, and this is where they practiced their art. And the temple was seen as kind of really founded at the time of Ur-3 kings and excavated by the Oriental Institute team from 1970s to 1990s, one of the latest excavations in Nippur. Archaeologists found lots of figurines. First of all, a lot of dogs that are inscribed because dogs were sacred to Gula. Second of all, figurines of persons in pain. So people were coming with a headache, with a leg, whatever sort of bodily problem you have, and that would be depicted in the votive statue that you offered to the god Gula. And so archaeologists found tons and tons of these kinds of figurines, votive figurines, brought to Gula. Now, at the end of my lecture, I would like to turn to Ur and talk briefly about the capital city of the Ur-3 kings and working as a port of trade. We see the North Harbor here, as well as the massive temple complex of the moon god Nana. We already spoke about the disk of Enheduanna, which was found here, and the institution of the high priestess. And so we see here this whole complex was constructed at the time of the Ur-3 kings. Just to remind you of the three important moments in the urban history of Ur, we studied a couple weeks ago the royal tombs of Ur that were excavated also in this site. And then during the time of the third dynasty of Ur, we see this kind of entire sanctuary of Nana is built with this kind of new design by the Ur-3 kings. And then there is a residential neighborhood that was excavated by Leonard Woolley, which we will study in the coming weeks. That's a kind of a second millennium part of the city, but we're not interested in that today. Here on the city map, you can see the location and immense scale of the moon god Nana complex, located conveniently between the North Harbor and the East Harbor. On the right is a more detailed plan of the moon god Nana complex with the ziggurat, the black rectangle, forming the center of attention for the monumental sort of core of the complex. One other structure that I'd like to sort of really draw your attention to is Gikparku, which is in the center left of the complex, which served as both as a residence but also as the ritual administrative headquarters of the Entu priestess, the high priestess office of the sanctuary, and I'll share with you the detailed plan of that as well. One word on the ziggurat of Ur-Nammu, a major architectural innovation here. A single shrine type building was located on the very top, accessed by a series of monumental staircases. And it was designed as a three-stage sort of tower temple complex. A ziggurat both meant as a to have a shrine on the very top. And of course, that third stage is not surviving. We only have the two stages of the structure today. And the Akkadian word zigguratu or zikuratu meant both a tower temple but also mountain peak. And so archaeologists and sort of ancient historians have suggested that maybe there's some kind of an allusion to the idea of an artificially created mountain here where the gods lived, where the gods are believed to have lived. But conveniently, this design of Ornamu that sort of really covers also the mound of sort of earlier temple structures that existed already at the site. A solid structure of built brickwork, so it was about 62 meters by 43 meters at its base, really monumental dimensions. Again, only the two stages out of the three stages are actually preserved, and the mud brick core is then covered with a baked brick facing on the outside, as thick as 2.5 meters in the lower sections, and on the upper sections it was more about 1 meter thick. And each of these bricks were actually stamped with the name of Ornamu written on them and written on them and as produced. And so you can see those inscriptions, the name of Ornamu in Sumerian. So I'd like to wrap up my lecture with this last slide on the Gigparco, the residence and administrative and ritual headquarters of the Entu priestesses, which were in charge of the moon god sanctuary complex as an urban and economic and religious institution. I'm sharing with you my architectural study. These are my drawings on the left. Architectural study of this building, a truly composite building, I want to say, that is that includes actually different kinds of functions, that brought together different kinds of functions within the building complex. And part of the structure is actually a temple. The sections that you see as yellow are actually temple complexes within, or something like a shrine or like a chapel within a monastery, right? The residential and private sections are green on top right, and the northeast section in the middle row we have funerary functions where the former Entu priestesses were buried. So there's a burial. Entu priestesses themselves were buried on the middle right in blue. Those are the sort of tombs of Entu priestesses there, which is then also connected to a ritual dining area and some kind of a kitchen that served that dining area as well. And you can see how substantial the structure is, with very thick walls all around, almost like a fortification. Some labyrinthian long corridors that control actually the circulation within the building. Very, very safe. Which actually is an incredible building structure, which incorporates different kinds of functions in a very innovative and ingenious way, while preserving this kind of really very monumental aspect of the building with two gates on north and south. And so this completes the second lecture of the week. And in the final and next video, we will look at Gudea and his sculptural portraits in diorite.